Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fall 2023 Paul J. Schatt Memorial Lecture. I'm Monica Allred. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here at the Cronkite School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and introduce our speaker for today's event. The Schatt Lecture Series began in 2007 in memory of former Arizona Republic reporter, editor, and columnist Paul J. Schatt, who taught public affairs reporting to Cronkite students for more than 30 years. The series in his name is supported by the Paul J. Schatt Lecture Series Endowment, established by Paul's family and the Cronkite School. Giving our lecture today is Mark Greenblatt, an award-winning investigative journalist and the executive editor of the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. As an investigative reporter, Mark led reporting for Inside the Global Fight for White Power, an investigative documentary that won first place in the 2023 National Headliner Awards and prompted the U.S. Department of State to designate individuals as terrorists who were in or linked to his reporting. The award-winning hour-long show aired nationally on more than 500 NPR member stations. Prior to joining Cronkite School, Mark Greenblatt served as the national investigative correspondent and coordinator of specialized reporting at Scripps News based in Washington, D.C. Please give a warm welcome to our Schatt lecturer, Mark Greenblatt.
Thanks so much, Monica. Let me just unlock this. I wish we didn't have to be here today talking about this. I wish that this wasn't a problem. Unfortunately, right now in America, hate extremism continues to be an issue. And if you're watching the headlines, you're knowing that there's a lot of conflict in the world. Today, we're going to talk about how some of the headlines that you see right here in the United States actually have more global connections than you may have previously thought about, may have previously connected. When I was an investigative reporter at Scripps, I spent more than a decade in Washington, D.C., leading investigative projects. On the day after January 6th, I was sitting in a meeting with my team at the time, and we talked about how little we really knew about the forces that had come to create what we all saw happen at the United States Capitol, and how much we had to learn. And so we set off on a collaborative venture that eventually led to uncovering a rising terrorist network that was getting together with white nationalists across borders into the United States in real ways that scared us, quite frankly. Some of the things we'll talk about today, I need to tell you, are not easy to watch. They're not easy to listen to. And so please know that this is a difficult subject, and some of the material that you'll hear is hard to listen to at times. And yet I think it is important to report on, and important to be aware of, important to address as a society, important to address as journalists. And so we'll talk about not only what is happening out there in the space of extremism and some of these global connections, but also what you can do about it as a journalist. And not only what you can do about it, but what you should not do about it. What I mean by that is we'll get into talking about some ethics. In May of 2023, a neo-Nazi walked into a Texas shopping mall in the Dallas suburbs and killed 8 people. If you didn't pay attention to what was happening and didn't understand what was happening underneath the surface of this event, you may have seen the headline and you may have thought, another mass shooting, oh my gosh, why is there another one more time? What I see in this event is a complex, global connected event that unfortunately had an extremist who was using online networks from over in Russia, and we'll talk about that in a minute, who believed in conspiracy theories and who was so convinced of problems that were happening in the world that were intractable in his view, that he had to pick up a gun and go and kill people because he felt he was at war. This was a person who had become convinced that he was at war with people that were not like him and did not see the world like him. One of the things that was found on this particular shooter's body when this event was done was a patch that said RWDS. And people wondered, why is he wearing a patch that said RWDS? RWDS, it turns out, is code. And this is something that a lot of people who are looking in isolation at events in the world don't necessarily realize how much code there is out there in the extremist world. But RWS, turns out, stands for Right-Wing Death Squad. Right-Wing Death Squad is a phrase that has been embraced and actually popularized in the far-right space by, most recently, you may have heard of the Proud Boys. And this is an organization that was heavily involved in the events of January 6th. And they began propping this RWS terminology up in modern days to, you can see the picture of the guy on the right is a member of the Proud Boys. He's wearing a PB for the Proud Boys hat, and he's got the Right-Wing Death Squad paraphernalia, this patch for himself on this flak jacket. The image on the left is an image of the shooter in Texas. He had been posting images, the shooter, these are two different people, but the guy on the left is a guy that was found with that RWS patch himself. And he, it is thought, had come to see that this is a way to approach the world that goes back to popularizing what a former Chilean dictator named Pinochet had done years ago, where he is thought to have murdered all of his political enemies. And so in these weird, dark online circles, this concept of being a death squad, murdering your political enemies, is what is being popularized, it is being celebrated, and in the most extreme cases, it is being carried out by copycat killers. And the guy on the left is one of the gentlemen. It's a terrible word for this guy, and I'll take it back. It's one of the guys who, it's a former, he's clearly, you can see he's emblazoned himself with swastikas and celebrating Nazi Germany. Other terminology to become aware of, if you haven't heard about this, we'll talk more about as the afternoon goes on. Rahowa, short for racial holy war. In these online circles, they're pushing the concept that if we can only create murders and events that put people and pit people against each other, we can create a racial holy war and a new age crusade that will have in the minds of the people who are picking up the guns too often will be defending the white race against what they perceive to be an invasion, a true invasion of an army that they believe they need to fight and kill. Another common terminology that is often shared in these online spaces is the number 1488, which is something that is actually a slogan that recently hit the Arizona State University community and our building when we were recently tagged with spray-painted terminology. There was a swastika that was emblazoned right here on our own building, and there was the terminology 1488 that was emblazoned next to it. The code here comes because in Germany, after World War II, it is illegal to talk about and post Nazi slogans. So the neo-Nazi community has come up with this code that stands for 14, which celebrates a 14 words that a very famous white supremacist came together, put together, and effectively encouraged white supremacists to engage in this sort of violence. 88 comes about because Hitler begins with the letter H. Heil Hitler is an HH terminology, and it turns out that H is the eighth letter in the alphabet, and so the Nazis of today have come together and they've made this code. If you see the words 1488 online, it is typically symbolic of someone who is talking about, or in code at least, neo-Nazi paraphernalia. The code is important because if you see it yourself, you need to understand the language. And understanding sometimes helps us perhaps make a plan to address some of this in whatever way we can. I began talking about how we would cover today how globally connected these events, such as the one that plays out in local headlines, how globally connected events really have become, and how inspired online different people who are moved to take action in different ways can be. And it turns out many people will be familiar with the events of January 6th on the right of your screen. But what people don't know is that many of the people that came out on January 6th, whether they be the Proud Boys, whether they be other organizations, not all, certainly not all. Some were there for mere political debate, but some were there because of deeply held extremist views. Some were there to protest the coronavirus and mask mandates, and that has become a bit of a rallying cry around the world. And what you may not know is that a few months prior to January 6th of 2021, the German parliament was raided also, and they had a smaller scale version of some kinds of people who were concerned about some of the same things that motivated January 6th, at least some of the factions of January 6th. This happened just a few months prior in Germany. And many of them came out because they were upset about what was happening in the world, and they believed in some larger problems that I came to understand are actually connecting and helping extremists connect across borders in ways that eventually got the federal government's attention. A couple of years ago, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence began talking openly about how they believed that what they refer to as a racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist had become, as of a few years back, the kinds of people that were most likely to conduct a mass casualty attack against civilians in the United States. Just let that sink in for a second. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, this is an organization that effectively is where all of the domestic intelligence of the United States comes together. All of the different agencies, including CIA and many others, funnel their intelligence on up through this organization. And they came to the collective conclusion that these people motivated by hate have become a real threat for real violence. In fact, the top threat in the United States for mass casualty attacks, at least against civilians. And in their view, the intelligence community assessed that United States racially motivated violent extremists also are the kinds of domestic violence actors with the most persistent and concerning transnational connections. So the very people who are the top threat to attack civilians here in the US are also the people who have some of the most concerning global connections. When a shooter in Buffalo went into the Tops supermarket and picked up a gun and murdered what he was aiming for to be as many black people as he could shoot. If you weren't paying attention to these geopolitical connections, you might see him as a lone wolf attacker. What came out after his attack is that he had been posting his motivations in his scribes, in his manifesto. And what he had said in the manifesto was the real war that he was advocating for is to get a war going between the Gentiles and the Jews. He says that we outnumber them 100 times, and they are not strong by themselves. And he viewed in these online dark spaces, he believed in a conspiracy theory that there is a Illuminati of sorts that sort of meets in smoky rooms somewhere and is controlling. It sounds so hard to believe to say these words out loud. It's uncomfortable for me to say, but that there is a real belief that there is a powerful group of elites that oftentimes, as people that I came in contact with explained to me, were people of Jewish faith working with others to foment this invasion of white society. And this shooter wanted to create a holy war that would pit people against each other and set off what is in many ways the same kinds of chaos that Charles Manson sought to create back when he was killing people decades ago in what he called he was looking for a helter-skelter moment where there would be chaos and wars and the white supremacists in dark online circles are celebrating each other. It turns out that while some of these attackers, if looked upon in isolation, are going after different kinds of people, they are often motivated by the same unifying idea that whites are being replaced. It's called the Great Replacement Theory. You may have heard about this because in recent years, it has been popularized and normalized to a point where there are some members of the media that will begin talking about this conspiracy theory, and they have normalized it in a way that is disturbing to people who track domestic threats for terrorism. Because if it seems normal to people, then it becomes that much easier to believe that it is something that needs to be fought. In Charleston, there was a shooter who killed 9 black parishioners. In Pittsburgh, there was a synagogue that was shot up where Jews were killed. In El Paso, there was an attack where a shooter went in and killed 23 folks of Hispanic persuasion and immigrants. That shooter who slaughtered those 23 people talked in his manifesto about an invasion that he had foreseen, that he needed to battle, and he chose his target in Walmart on the border because he could find as many people of brown skin as he could in one place to be able to fire his gun. This is serious stuff, and in talking about it even out loud right now, I can feel the weight of the stress that thinking about these topics is difficult to do, and yet I think we have to talk about them openly to understand why they keep happening, so that we can report on them and we can tell people about them, and perhaps people in positions of power can pass public policy, laws, and do something to try to stop the spread of this hate if we can. Interestingly, in the United States, the very top kind of minority that has been the subject of the most hate crimes, according to just released data from the FBI. These numbers came out just this month, looking back at the calendar year of 2022. And sorted on the right is the FBI's sort of analysis of who's being targeted for hate the most. These are incidents that go far beyond the killings that we've been discussing so far today. Hate is unfortunately much more pervasive in the United States than often gets attention, than often makes headlines. But these are largely examples of, in more cases than I wanted to know, actual physical or somehow other attacks against persons, actual some kind of attack against against people. More often than not, are these kinds of events, and you can see in the U.S. that attacks against blacks or African Americans far and away are the biggest problem that we have in the United States. From there, anti-Semitic attacks against the LGBTQ plus community, in particular against males, are overwhelmingly around the top three events. There are many other crimes that are reported to law enforcement entities that make up some of these other numbers, and the FBI believes these numbers are a vast underreporting of actual crimes that are taking place in the United States. So these are not someone saying something mean that might violate your moral consciousness. These are actual crimes that are tracked, known to law enforcement, and that make their way on up to the FBI as part of what used to be known as the National Uniform Crime Report. Has taken on a new name in recent years. Just this May, a new alert was issued by the Department of Homeland Security, re-upping their concern about different REMVs that have been charged in different attacks. They cited in their bulletin at the National Terrorism Advisory Center that in March of 2023, there was a REMV who was charged with attempting to use an improvised incendiary device to burn down a church that was planning to host a drag-themed event. In February, there were 2 REMVs that were associated with plotting an attack against electrical substations. That was in Maryland. And those arrests there followed a series of attacks against the electrical infrastructure, which some domestic violent extremists, according to the bulletin, have praised and leveraged to call for more attacks on critical infrastructure in the United States. Oftentimes, they're communicating online. The White House, just a few days ago, when these new statistics were released, came out with a statement that talked about what they were most concerned, as of a couple of days ago, with in the picture of what's happening in the United States. And in a statement attributed to President Joe Biden, the White House talked about how anti-Semitic hate crimes rose 25% between 2021 and 2022, and that accounted for over half of all reported religion-based hate crimes. They talked about how crimes against the LGBTQI plus community rose by 16%, and importantly, crimes against Muslim Americans and African Americans continue to be overrepresented among victims. Clearly, this remains a persistent problem in the United States. It's one the White House is aware about. It's a problem that top intelligence officials are aware about. And as uncomfortable as it is a problem we must address head on, and we must address through real reporting. I mentioned that after January 6th, my reporting team that I used to work with before coming to Cronkite set off on a journey to understand what was happening. And that landed in a podcast that we produced under the label Verified, The Next Threat. I worked with 2 very seasoned managers, Ellen Weiss and Suzanne Reber, who led the editorial process and oversight on those important projects, and they backed what was an important deployment of a major investigative team to really spend an unusual amount of time trying to unpack what was happening in the world. What we found was eventually something that went into a 6-episode podcast, and then it was repurposed by Reveal to go into an hour-long podcast that aired in 2 separate periods, once in 2022 and again earlier this year in 2023, each time being put out to more than 500 plus NPR affiliates. And we did a video for Scripps News that went out to different national audiences, and the collective ended up winning some of the top journalism prizes in America. And beyond journalism prizes, this reporting actually ended up making a difference, and it made an impact. I want to share with you some of what we did in that podcast to let you hear for yourselves what it is that we found. One of the people that I ended up connecting with is a designated terrorist in Russia outside of St. Petersburg, who is the head of an organization called the Russian Imperial Movement. His name is Stanislav Vorobyev. He is a designated terrorist in the United States. The Russian Imperial Movement is an organization that is known to have not just bad things to say online about others who don't believe in their view of society, but they actually have a training facility. Paramilitary-style guns are used to teach extremists or anyone who wants to come out to this facility to learn how to shoot and to learn how to build bombs. And it turns out that some people have taken him up on this training and then gone and used that training and flown off and attacked people with it. I wanted to understand more about what was motivating Mr. Vorobyev and the Russian Imperial Movement, and this is what he had to say.
We are currently in the process of gathering like-minded people throughout the world, including people from Australia, America, and New Zealand, wherever there are Christian communities.
So how do you connect with Americans right now, given your designation as a terrorist?
We are bringing an idea. This is what makes us dangerous for some people. To those guys who recognized us as terrorists, our ideas are what makes us dangerous. It's about consolidating all traditionalist forces and about resistance to the New World Order. This is the super idea.
The New World Order. He wants to resist the New World Order. What the heck is that, is what I said to myself the first time I heard about this. I'd never heard of it at the time I was having a conversation with him. I had to look it up. Turns out the New World Order is not so new. It is an old conspiracy theory that goes back to that Illuminati of sorts, sitting around and pulling strings and coordinating global forces across the world to come together to do things as a global unit that would, in Mr. Vorobyev's view, stop the rise to power of people who were Russian Orthodox Christians, in his view, that he was supporting and picking up guns to fight for. He's in a religious war. He's in what he calls a crusade, and he's actively trying to create a new crusade that he calls the Last Crusade, and he has flown to Europe and to Paris to recruit among white nationalists at conferences in Paris for the Last Crusade. It is a religious war, that religious war that we talked about at the beginning of the afternoon, and it is a movement. He does not view himself as someone who is directly command and controlling, leading an organization that gives orders. He wants to inspire people to take action on their own through ideas. And that is what he said is the reason why he was designated as a terrorist. It's also because he was training people. And the US State Department would say that overwhelming evidence showed that his actual training of extremists led to actual terrorism attacks. One of the people that Mr. Vorobyev introduced me to is the guy standing on the left, a guy named Manuel Andrino Lobo, who is, Mr. Vorobyev said, fighting in this Last Crusade with him. He's also the leader of an organization in Spain called La Falange. And Mr. Andrino Lobo put this on Twitter. It's now called X, where he claims to be in Tehran, about to be meeting with a very high-level minister in Iran, where he was allegedly going to be talking about his worldview and looking for a good audience with high-level leaders in Iran. I wondered what that meant And I went to an expert at the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism named Dr. Heidi Beirich, who is somebody who's testified on Capitol Hill many times, came to become a true expert in hate in America through leading the intelligence project that the Southern Poverty Law Center has, where they would designate different organizations as hate groups in the United States. And I asked her to help me unpack exactly what was happening here.
When I hear white supremacists starting to talk to governments, it worries me greatly, because there's a huge difference in terms of resources. You know, I don't know if Iran would ever get angry enough about its relationships with, you know, countries in the West, the United States, to be willing to arm or provide any kind of weapons. But if that ever happened, that would be a nightmare. We don't need our white supremacists in Europe, in the United States, Canada, whatever, Western white supremacists hooking up with a regime that is vehemently anti-Western.
And yet some are connecting across borders. I'm going to skip this one and talk about the importance one more time of doing journalism in this space. It turns out that at the time that we had begun putting together this network that stretched from Russia to Spain, it turns out Mr. Vorobyov in Russia had actually contacted an American neo-Nazi leader at the time named Heimbach, who physically invited the Russians over to America for a networking trip with the right and other white supremacists in the United States. They physically flew here for their first trip. They put up a Russian imperial flag in front of the White House, took a propaganda photo, shared it among their friends, and were introduced to people so that they could meet people here in the United States and continue on to make these connections, raise money, and create allies. The guy who invited them here and became the tour guide in the United States had flown many times to Europe for annual conferences, similar to how many people in the room here might go to IRE to learn how to become a better investigative reporter. They went to learn how to become better white nationalists. They went to Europe to bring people together from around the world to get better at what they were trying to do. I put everything together about the last crusade, about what the Russians were up to recently, about new connections that we had found, and I brought it to the United States State Department and told them, this is what we have. What do you make of all of this? Set up some off-camera briefings, and the people who lead the Counterterrorism Bureau of United States Department of State told us that this was new information. They had not made some of these connections themselves. They thought that it was critically important information, and they believed it was credible, and they believed it was of concern to the United States. At the time, they didn't have much of a plan. I'm going to show you what was one of the very few interviews that they've ever given in a recorded capacity from their headquarters in Washington, D.C., to talk about these issues. And I am proud to say that the reporting several months later, as you'll see, did lead to important new steps to attempt to dismantle the network we were reporting on.
Almost a year ago now, we sat down for a rare interview with top counterterrorism officials at the State Department for the podcast on global extremism, Verified the Next Threat. We asked about their lack of designations linked to two Swedish neo-Nazis from the Nordic resistance movement who flew to RIM's military-style training camps in St. Petersburg and returned home to bomb a series of left-wing and immigrant targets. Neither the bombers nor the group was ever labeled as a terrorist.
And they were convicted of taking bombs and placing them in refugee centers. How are they still out there undesignated?
Well, I'm not going to comment about a specific group or entity or individuals.
Hillary Bacher Johnson oversees the designations team at State, and at the time she acknowledged her team was frustrated.
They would love to be able to deploy this tool everywhere, and we just don't have the resources and the staff and the information.
Now that appears to have changed. In a statement Wednesday, the department said the U.S. government remains deeply concerned about the evolving racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist threat worldwide, and it said that it would designate one of the Swedish bombers as a terrorist. A Swedish court convicted Anton Tulin for the bombings. After his release from prison, the U.S. government says he went on to receive additional paramilitary training in Poland before he was expelled by Polish authorities, who cited the serious, real, and current threat to security and public order he posed. And state said that the moves this week would isolate the newly named individuals and open up new authority for law enforcement to track their moves. Mark Greenblatt.
One of the important things about the designation is it does legally allow entities like the NSA and the CIA to not only ramp up their surveillance of these individuals who are designated, but also anybody who connects with them and who talks with them. So these really are real world actions that went after also some people who were deeply connected to networking and deeply connected to fundraising, who will now be monitored in ways that they have not been monitored in the past. And so the message for me today to you is that your reporting can make a difference. If you take on these subjects and find something new and really carefully, accurately, and contextually report on these issues, you actually can make a difference through your reporting. Because people who have the ability to act can take what you help connect the dots on, and they can do things that actually can make a difference in this dark space. I set out one of the ways that I understood of tracking the network was that they communicate in surprising ways, in open ways, online, in their chat rooms. Telegram is a place where they had, the Russian Imperial Movement had openly posted many of, they're very active there. Odyssey, something called VK, which is sort of like a Russian version of Facebook. Gab, there's other social media accounts that are becoming useful to entities that are wanting to make these connections. And they're surprisingly and shockingly open about what they're doing. One person who was not open about what he wanted to do is a guy named Chris Hood, who was part of our reporting. This is an American neo-Nazi in the New England area who is part of what's called, he's part of what is known as the accelerationist movement, which here again is a group of people who believes not only are they white supremacists, but they believe violence is necessary in order to create the beginning of a racial holy war that will lead to the upending of society as we know it and the putting in place of society as we know it of people who effectively will allow white society to rule, and anybody who is not white to not have access to higher education, jobs, or advancement. And this guy was caught in an undercover recording with the leader of an organization called The Base, which is known to be a very dangerous accelerationist terrorist group that was trying to very actively buy up land in the United States, training areas for these kinds of people who think this way. Ronaldo Nazzaro is the leader of The Base, and recordings of Chris Hood, who was walking around a free man at the time that I was doing this reporting. Chris Hood was caught on these recordings talking about what his intentions were as a leader of a neo-Nazi group in New England, and then somebody of what he wanted to try to join at the time. He was actively trying to join this organization called The Base. I'm going to play for you 2 audio files so you can hear for them in their unfiltered space when they don't think anybody is listening in, the kinds of conversations that take place.
We've definitely been wanting to get into more of the, survivalist or self-defense type of stuff that, I know you guys are into, but, we're definitely used to the idea of, traveling far distances to meet with other, networks of guys that do similar things and, planning things that kind of veer, out of the lines of legality.
You kind of see sort of the limits of it, of some of this above ground activism stuff. So what in your mind should, kind of people be doing in general?
In, a world where, this small amount of people accepts that, there's not a peaceable solution to, our racist problems, then, there's a numerous amount of actions that you could take.
So again, this is his job interview to join a neo-Nazi accelerationist. I'm trying to play for you one more clip. Neo-Nazi accelerationist group, and he's asked, well, what is the path forward? And if I can get this to go.
What do you feel like at this point is kind of the way forward for activists or for people who are pro-white who want to do something?
I guess the way forward, I would say, it's definitely not going to be a peaceful one. And I never really had any disillusions of that. I guess with the original thought of idea of organizing the Patriot Front is assuming, or, just the assumption that, we would find an X amount of, a lot more of, higher quality, white men of capability to, do these things. And, at some point we would be at a level where we could, do some, 1930s style, Nazi Germany, overthrow the government or something like that.
If you engage in this reporting, it's not for the faint of heart. And it's important that you get all of this interpreted. And so my advice to you is to find your whisperers. As I said, we found Dr. Heidi Beirich as one individual, but many, many people who have dedicated their lives and their careers to covering extremists also helped us, including Jason Blazakis, a former State Department official, along with many entities that were formerly associated with the FBI. It's really important when you put reporting out, whether it be in any medium, that you warn your audiences, as we did today, that this is hard to listen to. Things to talk about in your newsroom before you press the publish button, before you really embark on these kinds of stories. Why are you giving these ideas attention? In the case of this reporting you've seen here, it's because we believed we had uncovered truly a new network that was rising, that was making new connections that our own government did not know about the full extent of. It's my firm belief that there are some people who are part of organizations that want the attention. They want you to report on them. When they put up a banner in the middle of town, and the banner says something objectionable, or it has a swastika, or it says something racist, oftentimes there's one organization called the Patriot Front that often puts their website at the bottom of the banner. They want you to go take a picture of this objectionable banner, put it out in a mass way through your audiences. And my message to you here today is, when you see that, ignore them. Absolutely ignore those people. Don't cover them, don't report on them, they want the attention. However, if you are doing and engaged in reporting that is unraveling something that they don't want out there, Mr. Hood did not want that leaked recording out in the world. He didn't like being asked about it. Then you know you're on the right track of something that is important for others to think about. You also want to ask how to take care of yourself and how to take care of your team, because this reporting is very, very hard to do. It takes a toll on you emotionally. I can tell you because when I spent some time in those social media rooms, it became difficult to go to bed at night sometimes to see how much dark material is out there in the world. And so if you engage in this, develop a support network, find people around you who can help. I also want to talk about how when you report on this area, it's important that you recognize racism is very sadly not new. It's not new in the world, and it's not new in the United States. It's been around a long, long time, and many people who will be experiencing your reporting will have their entire lives. In fact, the truth is that anyone who is alive today, I believe, has seen racism in dark ways. And so don't talk about it as something that's new, but it is okay to talk about what is new in the space, how it's evolving. We talked about the importance of talking about the impact on the team. how important emotional support is. And if you're involved in a team that gets into some of this reporting, check in with your editors, check in with your colleagues, check in and encourage them. Talk a lot and expect emotional swings. I don't want to stop talking today without giving you a path forward, or at least some ideas. And as I look at some areas that are both low-hanging fruit and some more complex, right now there are opportunities for even reporters right here in Phoenix, Arizona, to engage in important reporting. Earlier, I showed you some statistics at the FBI level, but unfortunately, far too many law enforcement organizations in the United States are not reporting in their crime statistics to the FBI, which means they're not reporting their hate crime statistics, which means that coming up with standardized ways of understanding the scope of the problem is literally impossible. It may be that you could go to the Phoenix Police Department, which has not turned in its crime data numbers, and ask them how many hate crimes you had last year, but they're not going to tell you the answer in a way that corresponds with the FBI's uniform way of reporting that number. They can give you their own definition, and that definition might be lower, it might be higher, we don't know. It deserves scrutiny, and when you hear that a city the size of Phoenix, Arizona, has not reported its statistics into the FBI, this is not just a matter of, oh, well, we won't have some stats, we can always get it. It's a matter of they have taken themselves out of the process to understand the problem so that as a society we can battle it. On a national level, President Biden, in the press release that I put up on screen a little while back, press release from just a few days ago, President Biden cited progress in hate crimes against Asian Americans. This was a really, really big problem a year ago that got a lot of attention. There was new legislation that was signed, and President Biden is taking some credit for signing the legislation and seeing in this year's numbers a reduction in crimes against Asian Americans by 38%. He's attributing that to this national legislation. Policy and public policy and attention to these matters can make a difference, according to the president's statement. And the question is what other policies are needed today, and what has yet to be put in place that needs more reporting that you have the potential to report on? I also don't want to leave today without talking about a new emerging threat that's in the headlines and that intelligence officials are watching and are concerned about. And that is that with the latest events in the Middle East, there is right here at home a new rise of new threats to, in particular, Jews and Muslims. And there have been some vicious attacks here on our shores that officials believe are linked to the rising tensions overseas. We talked about the individuals, how in Europe we're looking to try to connect with enemies of the United States. And on October 25th, just a few days ago, there was a new alert that was released by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, where they're concerned that ISIS itself is urging people to target what they call the Jewish presence all over the world, especially neighborhoods in America and Europe, and they are encouraging attacks on Jewish temples, nightclubs, and different economic interests. And the various entities, these outlets in bold, the alert from DHS and FBI warns that they're using verifiably doctored or mislabeled images and video footage, inaccurate translations, and misleading content about the conflict with the apparent intent to stoke passions, accelerate the process of radicalization, and lead individuals to engage in targeted violence. This is the thing that scares me the most about today, is with the advent of social media and the quick spreading of messages and the ability to doctor photos, the ability to doctor even videos, this is a problem that is a crisis, and that now the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are saying is being used intentionally to try to trick the world into acting and stoking flames. Our enemies in the United States want to see division. They want to hit us where we are weakest and find where we are most divided. And they want to pour gasoline in that part of us, and they want to light the match. As journalists, we must understand that this is happening, and we must confront it, we must report on it, because if we don't, we're in a lot of trouble. This is some serious stuff, and there's a decent number of you who have decided to stay and listen to a lot of hard to talk about issues, and I'm grateful for that. If there is anybody who's got questions about anything here, whether it be how do you deal with this as a reporter, where do we go next with this, I would just ask that you come up to the microphone because this is being streamed live and recorded as well, and feel free to come up to the microphone and we can engage in a conversation together.
Hi, that was an amazing lecture, but I was just wondering, you know, when it comes to interacting with these sources, you know, these extremists and stuff, how do you go about it? How do you maintain yourself personally? How do you give them a sense of comfort? Like, oh, I can trust this person, I can talk to them, because obviously that's a skill in itself, and I'm just wondering how you kind of at least start to do that.
I interact the same way I do any other source. I'm transparent about who I am. I'm not looking to be their friend, certainly. I'm looking to be honest with them about what I'm trying to do. When I reached out to the Russian terrorist, Vorobyev, I sent him a letter that I actually said, I'm an investigative reporter in the United States. I understand you're designated as a terrorist here. I'm engaged in reporting efforts that are trying to understand what white nationalists around the world are seeking, and I wondered what you thought of your designation as a terrorist and if you might be willing to speak with me about it. And so I'm open, I'm upfront, I'm not trying to do anything other than be a journalist in that kind of interaction. And I'm certainly listening with, as I would to any source, a skeptical ear and a skeptical eye to what I'm being told. And in these instances, I'm also talking very heavily with my editor. Every step of the way, I'm engaging management to make sure that they're aware of what I'm doing, to make sure that I have someone to talk to, that I'm not alone, and I'm checking, you know, my own assumptions along the way in order to make sure that I'm being a good journalist first.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So you do a lot of your own reporting, but when you talk about whisperers, are you talking about people who are like better at communicating with these radical groups than you are, or like how would you define a whisperer?
Somebody who knows more than I do about a subject. We call in the Howard Center, we often talk about how we're seeking tour guides, people who can fast track our learning. In this case, some of the connections that I wasn't looking for someone who was better or worse at connecting with these people, but I was looking for someone who had studied from a research-based standpoint the landscape, so that I could understand, okay, this stuff that I'm hearing about, like, is this just effectively a bunch of kooks who are getting together in a dark corner of the internet, and should I just sort of ignore them, or are they a serious threat? So I went to people who were in multiple different levels of expertise. Dr. Byrick is someone who had studied very deeply, had a doctoral degree in extremism, and by day she goes to work to track these people and track new developments. But I also talked to individuals who are connected to actual, threat, former senior level FBI agents. There was an organization called the Sufan Group that wrote about some of this reporting, that issued its own terror alert, bulletin, I think they called it, that talked about how some of the individuals featured in this reporting were actually really needed for more reporting because they were real security threat. Ali Sufan is a former supervisory special agent of the FBI who leads a very renowned think tank out of Washington, D.C. that tracks terror threats. And he could talk about, from a security standpoint, and his organization could talk from a security standpoint, a threat standpoint, what's real to pay attention to. And you combine expert voices, people who are in this, who are just smarter than you. I approach every story that we do as an investigative story thinking that there are people who know more about the topic than I do. And I should emphasize again the need to do the reporting, but this was done with we had a sizable team of at least 5 of us that were really heavily enmeshed in some of this, bouncing off of each other, checking our assumptions. But yeah, I'm looking for experts with different levels of really, high-level expertise that they can bring into the conversation and help keep us positioned smartly.
For sure. Thank you so much.
You bet. Any other questions?
I can go again.
Go ahead. Come back up.
Sorry, I just got like a million questions in my head. But I kind of have a question about prevention. A lot of time about these extremists, they're trying to recruit, especially, young white men who are able to be recruited. And those audiences tend to be ones we can't reach. So how do you think we do a better job at reporting so we can engage with audiences that may be susceptible to being recruited? We can't stop everything, but if we could even get out to one person before they do something terrible, is there something we can do better at that?
I mean, I think about who our audiences are is so important. There's some news organizations that are known to only get people who sort of are right-leaning. Some news organizations are known to only get people to watch or listen or read them if they're left-leaning. I think there's a lot of attention that's been paid to this recently, where the organizations that are more left-leaning are very intentionally highlighting more conservative voices in their newspapers and on television, where they'll bring in somebody who doesn't think like they might be assumed to be thinking like. So I think, for people that are leading news organizations, we can think about bringing in intentionally diverse viewpoints that might attract different audiences than what they've started with. But I think that it's also important to try to engage as many audiences as you can. When we did this reporting, again, we didn't just look at one distribution method. We thought it was important enough to offer out to others. There was a lot of people that reported on the reporting, and we engaged in that. And so hitting audiences on the radio, hitting audiences on national television outlet, hitting audiences in the podcast sphere where people are going to listen to something on demand if they choose to, from Apple or Stitcher. Getting the message out, getting the reporting out in as many different ways as possible to as many diverse audiences as possible. But from a pure news organization standpoint, I'd say make intentional efforts to engage different kinds of people.
All right, thank you again.
Hi, I am a journalist from Albania, and during the last months of summer, I worked with a few colleagues in Montenegro, in Bosnia, and in Macedonia on hate speech online and extremist narratives. We found many difficulties, not only in finding and exploring official data, but also in finding people, officials, who wanted to talk to us about that. Now, I wanted to ask you, did you face similar difficulties in finding official data and officials talk to that? And if yes, how did you cope with that?
I think that, that's not unusual, and we engaged with law enforcement in Europe on some of this reporting, and they were less actually willing to talk to us on a lot of levels. In the United States, I think part of it is gaining credibility with the federal officials. The way that I did it as a reporter was I had done some initial, we knew we were doing a big, long project, but some of the stories were put out in quicker clips along the way. And there was one story that we did that had engaged a former State Department official. And I, out of the blue, thinking about that I wanted to create a relationship with that entity, the Counterterrorism Bureau of the State Department, I took the clip and I sent it to them, and I just said, I just am sending this to you, I don't want anything from you, I just want you to be aware of this, and I'm gonna be around reporting in this space for a little while. I apparently got their attention. I got a phone call from their headquarters of them wanting to just engage with me a little bit more. Eventually, I started getting invited to some off-camera briefings, and eventually that sort of back and forth, I think they viewed us as what we were doing as taking a credible, serious look at this topic. So when I was able to tell them, I teased along the way, we got some interesting stuff, I'm gonna call you about it in a couple of weeks. When we put that call in, we got senior level people on the line to listen and to look into it. And when they did look into what we were talking about, they said, wow, this is some real stuff. And they then agreed to what was at the time the first podcast interview that had ever been done out of that bureau. And I believe it's one of the first recorded interviews that has been done out of their headquarters. So it's about being serious and making sure you develop the relationship as somebody who's going to be careful and responsible. And if you do that and you become known, I think maybe these entities will engage with you more often.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, that's, oh, we've got another one, yes.
Yeah. Sorry about that, just real quick.
Sure.
So I know you talk a lot about, doing reporting on behalf of actually what you're finding and what you've found regarding organizations. I believe you touched a little bit on it in your presentation, but what's the way to go about it in a way where you're informing people what's going on, but not necessarily giving these organizations a platform? Because I know you talk about presenting it with the intention of informing people, but a lot of times these organizations, that's their whole intention, is they want to have that platform so more people can come in, join whatever movement they have. So how do you go about it in a way that's both, informing, but also not trying to give them the benefit, if you get what I'm trying to say?
I mean, for us, we actually engaged before we published.
Okay.
We engaged some of these experts from various circles, and we asked them, multiple different kinds of people, do you think we're going to do more harm or more good, by putting some of this information out there? And one of the entities that was engaged, this led to them putting out a public bulletin to the intelligence community, really, is who their clients are. And they literally said, this space, there's some really hateful rhetoric that was mentioned by the guy that invited the Russians over for a tour of the United States. They said some of the stuff that we found that he was up to recently was truly of concern, needs more attention than it's been given by law enforcement entities, and needs to be publicly put out there. And I think the idea is check in with other people outside your newsroom who sort of are experts in this extremism space, get a sense for what others think, and don't make the decisions on your own in isolation or on a vacuum, or on an island. It's this kind of reporting you really need to engage as a team with not only people around you right now, but others that aren't in your newsroom as well.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for the work you do too. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's a great question. Francesca.
You knew I was going to ask a question. So the first example that you showed in this presentation was actually the mall in my hometown. I was visiting that weekend. You also talked about Patriot Front, which is a white supremacist organization that's also from where I'm from. The El Paso shooters are where I'm from. And I'm mentioning all of this because in Texas, there are only 2 reporters who cover extremism on a regular basis in a deep, enterprising, investigative kind of way. And that's surprising to me because white supremacy is staring all of us in the face in Texas. It's in our politics. It's in the mall where I went to growing up. And that's not because reporters don't want to cover it, but I have found anecdotally from talking to my peers that there's not a lot of support from editors. Editors either don't understand how important it is, or perhaps, and this is me speculating, maybe they're scared because this beat is sensitive in a security sense. You have to have knowledge of digital security and operate in a different way than you would on other beats. And in this room, most of us are early career reporters. What kind of advice do you have for those of us who are, might encounter an editor in the future who doesn't understand the importance of covering this in a way that's proactive and investigative and not reactive? because it was really disappointing to me that it took a few days after this shooting happened in my hometown. It was staring us in the face. If for those of us who were bombarded with the footage, because at this time Twitter had taken off the feature where you say basically, like when you see a video on Twitter at that point in May, you couldn't choose to not watch it. It just started playing immediately. And it was obvious that the shooter was wearing these extremist patches. And still, despite that, it took days because people didn't have this kind of deep knowledge. And Texas media were generally covering this really reactively, as if it was a surprise. But for anybody who pays attention, it's not a surprise that something like this happened. And we need more extremism beat reporters all across the United States. But I've found that some editors are hesitant or not supportive. And I'm wondering if you have any advice about that.
That's a great question. This isn't just as hard as it is to sit and talk about this topic. And as I started off today saying that I wish I didn't have to be here to talk about this, I'd rather be talking about the Arizona Diamondbacks and, the World Series. It's a lot more fun. But at the same time, this is what is... There's some very serious things happening in the world. And I guess I would give you the same advice, Francesca, that I'd give on any investigation. And that is that in order to capture your editor's attention, you need to help them understand what's new and what is original and what is important. And so I would encourage you to take the time to think about it in a pitch, in a succinct pitch, put it in writing, tell them what your reporting plan is, or her, tell him or her what your reporting plan is, and come up with something that is a path towards something that's original, new, and that would engage in a thoughtful way and add to the conversation in a responsible way, and that takes head on what you think might be their worries, but bottom line, give them a path where they can see it on paper in a short, succinct way, so it's a little bit easier for them to focus on the what's new here versus what might otherwise feel very intimidating, especially to an editor that hasn't been on this. But my position is that these entities that are out there, these connections that are happening are real. Don't take my word for it. Take the intelligence infrastructure of the United States, but also of the world. The think tanks in the major intelligence agencies of effectively Western society have come to the conclusion that this stuff is real. It's happening. And so we really could either bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it's not because it's difficult to talk about, or we can address it thoughtfully, carefully, and repeatedly. I think the United States learned a lesson many years ago on 9/11. We hadn't been taking seriously the kinds of things that serious people like Osama bin Laden were saying out loud at the time that they wanted to do. They just weren't, it was said, and I guess it was talked about in some circles, but it just wasn't being taken as seriously as it could have. And, it turns out that he was serious. And so, I'll quote one of the whisperers that we got in touch with to try to figure out, should we be listening to the guy in Russia? Should we take him seriously or not? And the advice I got back was, if a terrorist is telling you he wants to do something, lean and err on the side of listening to him, that he might actually be serious. And so, I would just say be responsible, careful, succinct in your pitches. You still got to be a good journalist to make the pitch. And if you give a good path to a story idea, all I can say is I hope that they'll buy it, because this is important. It is important to get more reporting on it, especially people who are more veterans who understand this, because it does take a minute to get up to speed on the language, to get up to speed on the context, to make the relationships with people who have tracked this. So there is value in investing in somebody who can, as a reporter, do a good, credible job.
Yeah, they really do have their own set of symbols and language, and it takes time to learn that. Thank you for your answer.
You bet. All right. Well, that's an hour and 10 minutes I think we've devoted towards this topic. I hope that you may not have found this easy, but I hope you've found it important. On behalf of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications and the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, I'd just like to thank you all for coming and investing your time this afternoon. And anybody who has any further questions on this, reach out to me. Easy to find. Thanks so much.
you.